Margaret Collins had always been particular about her morning routine. At 63, she insisted that consistency was the key to a peaceful retirement. Every day at exactly 6:30 a.m., she would turn on her vintage wooden radio while preparing breakfast, listening to the local news station that had been broadcasting from downtown since 1952. The radio crackled to life that Tuesday morning, filling her small kitchen with the familiar voice of news anchor Dave Morrison. Margaret hummed softly as she buttered her toast, half listening to reports about city council meetings and upcoming community events. But something in the broadcaster's tone made her pause mid-bite. Breaking news this morning regarding the ongoing federal investigation into financial irregularities at several local businesses. Dave's voice carried an unusual urgency. Sources close to the investigation tell us that authorities are particularly interested in speaking with individuals who may have been involved in money laundering, operations disguised as legitimate retirement activities. Margaret set down her coffee cup, her attention now fully captured. The radio continued with details that seemed oddly specific for a general news report. Mentions of jogging routes, early morning activities, and suspicious cash transactions at local banks. She found herself leaning closer to the radio, as if the wooden cabinet held secrets meant only for her ears. Outside her window, she could see her neighbor's house across the quiet suburban street. Robert Chen had moved in about 2 years ago, claiming to be a recently retired accountant who enjoyed morning jogs. He seemed pleasant enough during their brief conversations over the fence, always mentioning his passion for staying active in his golden years. Margaret had even admired his dedication, seeing him leave for his runs every morning at precisely 7 o'clock. The radio report continued with more details about the investigation. Something about offshore accounts, coded communications, and the use of seemingly innocent daily routines to mask illegal activities. Margaret's elderly cat, Whiskers, jumped onto the kitchen counter, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, connecting dots that she wasn't sure she wanted to connect. She had always prided herself on being observant. Years of teaching elementary school had sharpened her ability to notice when something wasn't quite right. And lately, there had been small details about Robert that didn't quite add up. The expensive running shoes that seemed too pristine for someone who jogged daily, the way he always carried a small backpack, even for short runs around the neighborhood, the fact that his retirement lifestyle seemed unusually well-funded for someone his age. As the news report concluded and transitioned to weather updates, Margaret found herself staring out the window at Robert's house with new eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across his perfectly manicured lawn, and she noticed his garage door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see what looked like multiple bicycles and exercise equipment, far more than one person would need for simple fitness routines. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was her daughter Sarah, calling from 3 states away for their weekly check-in. Margaret found herself distracted during the conversation, giving short answers while continuing to watch the house across the street. When Sarah asked if everything was all right, Margaret almost mentioned her suspicions but stopped herself. After all, what did she really know? Perhaps she was just being paranoid, letting her imagination run wild because of a news report that might not even be related to her neighborhood. But as she hung up the phone, Margaret noticed Robert emerging from his house for his morning jog. He looked exactly as he always did, middle-aged man in athletic wear, stretching briefly before setting off down the street. Yet something about his movements seemed different now that she was really paying attention. There was a purposefulness to his routine that went beyond simple exercise. He checked his watch, looked both ways down the street, and adjusted his backpack with the precision of someone following a carefully planned schedule. Margaret remained at her kitchen window long after Robert disappeared around the corner. The radio had moved on to traffic reports, but her mind was still processing the morning's news. She thought about the federal investigation, about her observant neighbor who seemed to have more secrets than stories, and about the strange feeling that her quiet retirement neighborhood might not be as peaceful as she had always believed. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating details she had never noticed before. Robert's house, she realized, had security cameras that seemed unnecessarily sophisticated for a suburban home. The landscaping was immaculate, but there were no personal touches that would indicate someone who actually spent leisurely retirement time gardening. Even his mailbox looked too perfect, too carefully maintained. As Margaret finally turned away from the window to finish her breakfast, She couldn't shake the feeling that the radio had been speaking directly to her. The timing seemed too coincidental, the details too specific. She found herself wondering if other neighbors had heard the same report, and if they too were beginning to question what they thought they knew about the retired jogger who lived across the street. Over the next 3 days, Margaret found herself becoming an amateur detective. She had never considered herself the nosy neighbor type, but the radio report had planted a seed of curiosity that grew stronger with each passing hour. She began timing Robert's departures, noting that his jogs always lasted exactly 47 minutes and followed the same route through the neighborhood. On Thursday morning, Margaret decided to take her own walk, something she rarely did since her knee surgery the previous year. She told herself it was for exercise, but deep down she knew she wanted to observe Robert's routine more closely. Armed with a walking stick and wearing her most comfortable shoes, she set out 15 minutes after Robert had left, hoping to intersect with his return route. The neighborhood looked different from street level than it did from her kitchen window. She noticed details that had escaped her attention before. The way certain houses had small chalk marks near their mailboxes, the fact that several residents seemed to time their own morning activities around Robert's schedule, and most intriguingly, the presence of an unmarked white van that had been parked on different streets throughout the week. As Margaret rounded the corner onto Maple Street, she spotted Robert ahead of her, jogging steadily toward the small park that marked the halfway point of his route. But instead of continuing through the park as she expected, he veered left toward the old community center that had been closed for renovations. Margaret watched from a distance as he approached a man in casual clothes who was sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. The interaction was brief, but clearly purposeful. Robert adjusted his backpack, and the man on the bench folded his newspaper in a specific way before both men went their separate directions. Margaret's heart raced as she realized she had just witnessed what looked like a textbook example of a covert exchange, the kind of thing she had seen in countless crime dramas but never imagined she would observe in her own quiet neighborhood. She hurried home, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. The radio was still playing softly in her kitchen, and as if summoned by her thoughts, another news update began. This time, the reporter mentioned that federal agents were asking residents to report any suspicious activities, particularly those involving regular patterns of behavior that might be used to disguise illegal operations. Margaret sat down heavily in her favorite chair, staring at the radio as if it could provide more answers. The timing of these reports seemed impossible to ignore. It was as if the radio knew exactly what she needed to hear, exactly when she needed to hear it. She began to wonder if other neighbors were receiving the same information, or if somehow these broadcasts were specifically targeted to her area. That afternoon, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She called the local police station, not to report a crime, but to ask general questions about the federal investigation mentioned on the radio. The desk sergeant was polite but vague, confirming that there was indeed an ongoing federal operation but unable to provide specifics. When Margaret asked about the radio reports, the sergeant seemed genuinely puzzled, stating that the department hadn't issued any specific bulletins to local media about the investigation. This revelation troubled Margaret more than she cared to admit. If the police weren't releasing these detailed reports to the radio station, where was the information coming from? She spent the evening researching the news station online, discovering that while it was indeed a legitimate local broadcaster, several of its recent reports about federal investigations couldn't be verified through other news sources. Friday morning brought another surprise. As Margaret prepared her breakfast and turned on the radio, the familiar voice of Dave Morrison was replaced by a different announcer. When she called the station to inquire about Dave's absence, she was told that no one named Dave Morrison had ever worked there. The current morning anchor, they insisted, had been with the station for over 15 years. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She was certain she had been listening to Dave Morrison's voice every morning for the past week. His reports about the federal investigation had been detailed and specific, providing information that seemed to relate directly to her observations about Robert Chen. But if Dave Morrison didn't exist, who had been speaking to her through the radio? She spent the day researching radio frequencies, wondering if perhaps she had been picking up signals from another station, or even some kind of unlicensed broadcast. But every test she performed confirmed that her radio was tuned to the correct local station. The mystery deepened when she realized that her radio was an old analog model that shouldn't have been capable of receiving digital signals or specialized transmissions. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just a week earlier. She was going to start documenting everything she observed about Robert Chen and anything else that seemed unusual in the neighborhood. If the radio was somehow providing her with information about a real federal investigation, then perhaps she had a responsibility to pay attention and take action. She set up a notebook with times, dates, and detailed observations. She also positioned a small digital camera near her kitchen window, hoping to capture photographic evidence of the activities she had been witnessing. Margaret had never thought of herself as someone who would become involved in law enforcement activities. But the mysterious radio broadcast had awakened something in her that demanded answers. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret turned on the radio one more time, hoping for another update from the enigmatic Dave Morrison. Instead, she heard only standard evening programming, classical music, and weather reports. But she had the distinct feeling that tomorrow morning would bring new revelations, and that her quiet retirement was about to become much more complicated than she had ever imagined. Saturday morning arrived with an unexpected twist. Margaret's radio remained silent until 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes later than usual. When Dave Morrison's voice finally emerged from the speakers, he sounded different, more urgent, almost conspiratorial. His first words made Margaret drop her coffee mug, sending ceramic shards across her kitchen floor. "Good morning, Margaret. I hope you've been paying attention to your neighbor's activities. Today is going to be very important." Margaret stared at the radio in shock. The voice had addressed her by name. This was impossible. Radio broadcasts didn't work that way. She looked around her empty kitchen, wondering if she was losing her mind or if someone was playing an elaborate prank. But Dave Morrison's voice continued with the same professional tone she had grown accustomed to, as if personally addressing listeners was the most natural thing in the world. "Robert Chen will be making his usual jog this morning, but today's route will include a stop at the First National Bank on Elm Street. The package exchange we discussed will take place at approximately 7:23 a.m. You'll want to document this carefully." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her notebook. This was beyond strange. It was impossible. Radio broadcasts couldn't be personalized, couldn't know her name or provide specific instructions meant only for her. Yet the voice was unmistakably the same Dave Morrison, who had been providing her with information all week. She found herself following his instructions despite her confusion, positioning herself at the kitchen window with her camera ready. At exactly 7 a.m., Robert emerged from his house for his morning jog. But today, Margaret noticed something different about his appearance. He wore a bright red baseball cap instead of his usual plain visor, and his backpack seemed fuller than normal. More importantly, he turned left instead of right when he reached the street, heading in the direction of downtown rather than toward the park. Margaret made a split-second decision that would have terrified her cautious nature just a week earlier. She grabbed her purse and car keys, determined to follow Robert at a safe distance. Her old Honda started reluctantly, but she managed to pull out of her driveway, just as Robert rounded the corner onto the main road leading toward the city center. Driving slowly and staying several car lengths behind, Margaret followed Robert's jogging route through neighborhoods she rarely visited. The morning traffic provided good cover, allowing her to observe without being obvious. She noticed that Robert maintained a steady pace but frequently checked his watch and occasionally looked over his shoulder, behaviors that seemed more cautious than necessary for a simple fitness routine. When Robert reached Elm Street, Margaret parked across from the First National Bank and watched through her rearview mirror. At precisely 7:23 a.m., just as Dave Morrison had predicted, Robert approached a woman in business attire who was waiting near the bank's entrance. The woman carried a briefcase that seemed too large for normal banking business, and their interaction followed the same pattern Margaret had observed at the community center: brief, purposeful, and involving some kind of exchange. Margaret's heart pounded as she took several photographs with her digital camera. The evidence was mounting that Robert was indeed involved in activities that went far beyond recreational jogging. But the bigger mystery remained: how did Dave Morrison know these details in advance? How could a radio announcer predict specific times and locations for clandestine meetings? After the exchange, Robert began jogging back toward their neighborhood, but he took a different route that led him past several other locations where brief interactions occurred. Margaret documented each stop, noting the times and descriptions of the people Robert encountered. By the time he completed his circuit and returned home, she had photographed evidence of at least 5 separate meetings that appeared to be part of a coordinated operation. When Margaret returned home, she immediately turned on the radio, hoping for an explanation or further instructions from the mysterious Dave Morrison. But the station was broadcasting its normal Saturday programming, community announcements, and local weather updates. No mention of federal investigations, no personalized messages, and certainly no voice claiming to be Dave Morrison. Margaret spent the afternoon developing her photographs and organizing her notes. The evidence was compelling but raised more questions than it answered. She had clear documentation of Robert Chen's suspicious activities, but she also had to confront the impossible reality of receiving personalized information through her radio. Either she was experiencing some kind of psychological episode, or something extraordinary was happening that defied conventional explanation. That evening, Margaret made another call to the local police station, this time asking to speak with someone about the federal investigation mentioned in recent news reports. After being transferred several times, she finally reached Detective Williams, who agreed to meet with her the following day to review her observations and evidence. As she prepared for bed, Margaret positioned her radio near her nightstand, hoping that Dave Morrison might provide some explanation for the day's events. She dozed fitfully, waking several times to check if the radio was broadcasting anything unusual, but it remained silent except for the standard overnight programming of classical music in public service. Announcements. Margaret's last coherent thought before falling asleep was the realization that tomorrow's meeting with Detective Williams would either validate her observations or confirm her worst fears about her mental state. Either way, she was committed to seeing this mystery through to its conclusion, no matter how impossible it seemed. The radio sat quietly on her nightstand, its analog dial glowing softly in the darkness, giving no indication of the extraordinary communications it had facilitated over the past week. Margaret slept uneasily, dreaming of voices that knew her name and neighbors who weren't what they seemed to be. Detective Williams turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a patient demeanor that immediately put Margaret at ease. They met at a small coffee shop downtown, away from the police station, which Williams explained was standard procedure when dealing with sensitive information from civilian sources. Margaret had brought her notebook, photographs, and a written timeline of everything she had observed over the past week. As Margaret began explaining her observations about Robert Chen, Detective Williams listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in her own small notebook. When Margaret reached the part about the radio broadcasts and Dave Morrison's personalized messages, she watched carefully for signs of skepticism or concern about her mental state. Instead, Williams leaned forward with increased interest. "Mrs. Collins, I need to ask you something very important," Williams said quietly. "Have you told anyone else about these radio communications? Anyone at all?" Margaret shook her head, confused by the detective's intense focus on this aspect of her story. She had expected Williams to be more interested in the photographs and documented meetings, not the impossible radio broadcasts that Margaret herself barely believed. Williams opened her briefcase and pulled out a file folder that she placed carefully on the table between them. "What I'm about to tell you must remain completely confidential. The federal investigation you've been hearing about on the radio is real, and Robert Chen is indeed a person of interest. But here's what makes your situation extraordinary. There have been no official radio broadcasts about this investigation." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "But I heard them. I have been hearing detailed reports for over a week. Dave Morrison has been providing specific information about—" "Mrs. Collins," Williams interrupted gently, "there is no Dave Morrison working at your local radio station. In fact, the federal agents running this operation have been trying to understand how information about their investigation has been leaking to unauthorized sources. Your call yesterday helped us realize that the leak isn't coming from inside law enforcement." Williams opened the file folder, revealing surveillance photographs that matched several of Margaret's own pictures. "You've documented meetings and activities that our agents have been watching for months. Your observations are accurate and valuable, but the radio communications you've been receiving appear to be coming from someone with inside knowledge of both the federal operation and your personal habits. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process this information. If the radio broadcasts weren't official and weren't coming from law enforcement, then who was Dave Morrison? And how did he know so much about both the investigation and her daily routine? Detective Williams, are you suggesting that someone has been deliberately feeding me information through my radio? That someone wants me to be watching Robert Chen? Williams nodded grimly. That's exactly what we think. The question is whether this unknown source is trying to help the investigation or compromise it. Either way, you've become an unwitting participant in something much larger than neighborhood surveillance. They spent the next hour going through Margaret's photographs and notes in detail. Williams confirmed that several of the people Margaret had photographed were known associates of Robert Chen, who were also under federal investigation. The meetings Margaret had documented corresponded exactly with intelligence the federal agents had gathered through their own surveillance operations. Mrs. Collins, I need to ask for your continued cooperation, but I also need to warn you that you may be in danger. Whoever has been communicating with you through your radio knows your identity, your address, and your daily routine. They've been using you as an additional surveillance asset, which means they have sophisticated technical capabilities and detailed knowledge of this investigation. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She had been so focused on the mystery of Robert Chen that she hadn't fully considered the implications of being personally targeted by whoever was behind the radio communications. What do you think they want from me? We're not sure yet. It's possible they're legitimate federal agents using unofficial channels to gather additional intelligence. It's also possible they're part of the criminal organization we're investigating, and they're using you to monitor our surveillance activities. Either way, your safety is now a priority. Williams explained that federal agents would be discreetly monitoring Margaret's house and neighborhood for the next several days. They would also be analyzing her radio to determine how the personalized broadcasts were being transmitted. In the meantime, Margaret was instructed to continue her normal routine but to document any further communications from Dave Morrison. If this mysterious broadcaster contacts you again, we need you to ask specific questions, Williams said, handing Margaret a list of prepared inquiries. These questions will help us determine whether we're dealing with legitimate federal agents or something more sinister. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Williams placed a small device on the table. This is a secure communication device. If you receive any more radio broadcasts or notice anything unusual, press the red button and speak your observations aloud. Federal agents will be monitoring this channel around the clock. Margaret drove home with her mind spinning. The quiet retirement she had enjoyed for the past 2 years had suddenly become the center of a federal investigation involving unknown broadcasters. Money laundering operations and surveillance activities that she barely understood. Her simple morning routine of listening to the radio while eating breakfast had somehow connected her to a world of criminal investigations and covert operations. That evening, Margaret positioned her radio near the kitchen table and waited. She had so many questions for Dave Morrison if he contacted her again. Who was he really? Why had he chosen her to provide information? And most importantly, was he trying to help law enforcement or was he part of the criminal organization they were investigating? As the hours passed and the radio remained silent, Margaret realized that tomorrow morning would likely bring answers to questions she had never thought to ask. Her involvement in this investigation was no longer accidental or voluntary. Someone with significant resources and inside knowledge had deliberately drawn her into a complex operation, and now federal agents were counting on her to help uncover the truth. The radio sat quietly on her kitchen table, its presence now feeling more ominous than comforting. Margaret spent a restless night wondering if she would ever again be able to listen to her morning news broadcasts without questioning the source and motivation behind every word. Monday morning arrived with an eerie silence. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the radio that had remained quiet since her meeting with Detective Williams. The normal morning programming played softly. Weather reports, traffic, updates, and community announcements, but no sign of Dave Morrison or any information about federal investigations. She began to wonder if the mysterious broadcast had ended permanently, leaving her with more questions than answers. At exactly 7 a.m., Robert Chen emerged from his house for his usual jog, but something was different. Instead of his typical athletic attire, he wore dark jeans and a heavy jacket despite the warm morning weather. More significantly, he carried a large duffel bag instead of his usual small backpack. Margaret immediately reached for the secure communication device Detective Williams had given her. "This is Margaret Collins. Robert Chen just left his house, with a large duffel bag instead of his usual jogging gear. He's wearing street clothes and appears to be heading toward downtown rather than his normal running route." Within minutes, Margaret noticed increased activity on her street. A utility truck appeared at the corner, and a woman walking her dog lingered near Robert's house longer than seemed natural. The federal agents were clearly responding to her report, positioning themselves to follow Robert's movements. At 7:15 a.m., Margaret's radio crackled to life with a familiar voice that made her heart race. "Good morning, Margaret. I see you've been talking to our friends in law enforcement. That's good. They'll need your help for what's about to happen today." Margaret grabbed her notebook and the list of questions Detective Williams had provided. "Dave Morrison, I need to know who you are and why you've been contacting me. The federal agents want to understand your connection to this investigation." There was a pause before Dave's voice returned, sounding amused. "Margaret, you're asking the wrong questions. The federal agents you've been talking to aren't the only law enforcement officials interested in Robert Chen. There are multiple investigations happening simultaneously, and not all of them are coordinated." This revelation sent a chill through Margaret. Detective Williams hadn't mentioned competing investigations or the possibility that different agencies might be working at cross purposes. "What do you mean by multiple investigations?" "Robert Chen isn't just involved in money laundering, Margaret. He's been providing financial services to several criminal organizations, while also feeding information to federal agents as a confidential informant. Today he's planning to disappear with evidence that could compromise multiple ongoing operations." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process this information. If Dave Morrison was correct, then Robert Chen was playing multiple sides against each other, collecting money from criminals while providing intelligence to law enforcement. But this raised even more questions about Dave Morrison's identity and motivations. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do with this information?" "Margaret, look out your front window. Do you see the black sedan that just parked across from Robert's house?" Margaret moved to her living room window and peered through the curtains. Indeed, a black sedan with tinted windows had positioned itself with a clear view of Robert's house. But this vehicle was separate from the utility truck and other surveillance assets she had noticed earlier. "I see it. Who are they?" "They're not federal agents, Margaret. They're associates of one of the criminal organizations that Robert has been betraying. They're here to prevent him from reaching his destination with that duffel bag. In about 10 minutes, this quiet neighborhood is going to become very dangerous." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the secure communication device. She needed to warn Detective Williams about the developing situation, but she also realized that Dave Morrison seemed to have more current intelligence than the federal agents she had been working with. "Dave, if you know all this, why aren't you working directly with law enforcement? Why use me as an intermediary?" "Because, Margaret, I am law enforcement. But I'm working for a different agency than Detective Williams, and our operations haven't been coordinated. Your involvement has actually helped us realize that Robert Chen has been playing multiple agencies against each other for months." Before Margaret could respond, she heard the sound of car doors slamming and saw several men in dark clothing emerge from the black sedan. At the same time, the utility truck began moving quickly down the street, and the woman with the dog started speaking rapidly into a concealed microphone. "Margaret, you need to get away from your windows and move to the back of your house immediately. Robert Chen is about to return, and when he does, there's going to be a confrontation between two groups of armed individuals who both believe they have legitimate authority to apprehend him." Margaret grabbed the secure communication device and pressed the red button while moving quickly toward her bedroom. "This is Margaret Collins. There are multiple groups of armed individuals converging on Robert Chen's house. I've been told there are competing law enforcement operations that haven't been coordinated. The situation is about to become dangerous." As she reached her bedroom, Margaret heard the distinct sound of car engines accelerating and what sounded like shouted commands from multiple directions. Through her back window, she could see Robert Chen jogging down the alley behind the houses, apparently unaware of the activity gathering in front of his home. Dave Morrison's voice crackled through the radio one more time. "Margaret, what you're witnessing is the collision of several separate investigations into the same criminal network. Robert Chen has been providing information to different agencies, while also working for the criminals they're investigating. Today, everyone involved has realized they've been manipulated, and they're all trying to apprehend him simultaneously. Margaret crouched beside her bed, listening to the increasingly chaotic sounds from the street in front of her house. Doors continued slamming. Engines revved, and she could hear multiple voices shouting what sounded like conflicting law enforcement commands. Her quiet retirement neighborhood had become the center of a complex criminal investigation that involved competing agencies, double agents, and criminal organizations. Through it all, the most unsettling realization was that Dave Morrison, whoever he really was, seemed to be the only person with complete knowledge of all the moving pieces in this dangerous game. The confrontation Margaret had been dreading erupted with sudden violence. From her bedroom window, she watched as Robert Chen rounded the corner from the alley, still carrying his duffel bag, only to find himself facing multiple groups of armed individuals who all seemed to believe they had authority to arrest him. The situation devolved into chaos within seconds. Margaret pressed herself against the floor as she heard shouting, car engines racing, and what sounded unmistakably like gunshots. The secure communication device in her hand crackled with urgent voices as federal agents tried to coordinate their response to a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Dave Morrison's voice cut through the confusion on her radio. Margaret, stay down and stay away from windows. What you're witnessing is the result of Robert Chen playing multiple law enforcement agencies against each other for over 2 years. He's been collecting money from criminals while providing just enough legitimate information to different agencies to maintain his value as an informant. Through the chaos outside, Margaret could hear Detective Williams' voice on the secure communication device, barking orders to federal agents and demanding to know how the operation had been compromised. But Dave Morrison seemed to have real-time intelligence that the official federal agents lacked. Robert Chen is not going to be captured today. He's too smart and has planned too carefully for this eventuality. In approximately 3 minutes, a helicopter will land in the field behind your neighborhood. Robert will abandon the duffel bag and escape while the different law enforcement groups are fighting over jurisdiction and trying to avoid shooting each other. Even as Dave spoke, Margaret could hear the distant sound of rotor blades approaching. The prediction was proving accurate with terrifying precision. Whoever Dave Morrison really was, he had access to intelligence that went far beyond what Detective Williams or the federal agents seemed to possess. The gunfire outside had stopped, replaced by angry shouting as different groups of law enforcement officers tried to establish their authority over the scene. Through her bedroom window, Margaret could see Robert Chen moving quickly through her backyard, no longer carrying the duffel bag but heading directly toward the open field where the helicopter sounds were growing louder. Dave, who are you really? How do you know all this in advance? Margaret, I'm someone who has been watching this investigation from a perspective that none of the agencies involved fully understand. Robert Chen isn't the mastermind of this operation. He's just a very clever middle manager who figured out how to profit from the confusion between competing law enforcement agencies. The helicopter noise had become overwhelming, and Margaret could see the aircraft settling into the field behind her neighborhood. But instead of law enforcement markings, the helicopter appeared to be civilian, possibly even private. Robert Chen emerged from the tree line and began running toward the aircraft. Detective Williams's voice on the secure communication device was becoming increasingly frantic. All units. We have a civilian aircraft in the landing zone. Repeat, unauthorized civilian aircraft is attempting to extract the suspect. Dave Morrison's radio broadcast continued with the same calm, professional tone that had characterized all his communications. Margaret, the helicopter is registered to a private security company that provides extraction services for federal witnesses who believe their safety has been compromised. Robert Chen called in this extraction when he realized that multiple agencies were closing in on him simultaneously. Margaret watched in amazement as Robert Chen reached the helicopter and climbed aboard. Without any interference from the law enforcement agents who were still arguing about jurisdiction in front of his house, the aircraft lifted off smoothly and disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a neighborhood full of confused and angry federal agents. But why tell me all this? Why have you been using me to monitor the situation? Because, Margaret, you were the only truly neutral observer. You weren't part of any agency's operation. You weren't being paid by any criminal organization, and you weren't trying to advance any particular agenda. Your observations provided an objective record of Robert Chen's activities that none of the competing agencies could trust from each other. As the immediate chaos subsided, Margaret ventured to look out her front window. The street was filled with official vehicles from what appeared to be at least 3 different law enforcement agencies. Detective Williams was standing near Robert's house, gesturing angrily while speaking on multiple phones simultaneously. Dave Morrison's voice returned one final time. "Margaret, your role in this investigation is now complete. The federal agents will want to debrief you extensively, and you should cooperate fully with Detective Williams. But understand that what you've witnessed represents a systemic problem in how different agencies handle overlapping investigations." "Will I hear from you again, Dave?" "Probably not, Margaret. My job was to ensure that there was an independent record of Robert Chen's activities, and that someone outside the official investigations could provide objective testimony about what really happened. You've done that job perfectly." Margaret sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the sounds of law enforcement officers securing the scene outside her house. Her quiet retirement had been permanently disrupted by her accidental involvement in a complex criminal investigation that involved competing agencies, double agents, and mysterious radio broadcasters who seemed to know more than anyone else involved. The most unsettling realization was that she might never know the complete truth about what had happened. Dave Morrison had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind only questions about his identity and the authority under which he had been operating. Detective Williams and the federal agents would undoubtedly want detailed explanations, but Margaret suspected that her mysterious radio contact had information that even they didn't possess. As she prepared to face the inevitable interrogations and debriefings, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her role in this investigation had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning by someone with far more knowledge and authority than anyone had realized. 3 months later, Margaret Collins sat in her kitchen, sipping her morning coffee and listening to the regular programming on her vintage radio. The familiar voice of the station's longtime morning anchor provided weather updates and community announcements, but there had been no sign of Dave Morrison since the day Robert Chen escaped in the helicopter. Detective Williams had conducted extensive debriefings with Margaret, and federal investigators had analyzed her radio thoroughly, without finding any evidence of how the mysterious broadcasts had been transmitted. The technical analysis concluded that her radio shouldn't have been capable of receiving personalized communications. Yet Margaret's detailed notes and observations had proven invaluable to the investigation. The official case files, which Detective Williams had partially shared with Margaret, revealed that Robert Chen had indeed been operating as a confidential informant for 3 different federal agencies simultaneously. He had been providing each agency with enough legitimate information to maintain his value while using his protected status to expand his money laundering operations. The competing investigations had created jurisdictional confusion that Robert had exploited for over 2 years. Margaret learned that the criminal organizations Robert had been serving were much larger than anyone had initially realized. His escape had triggered a massive federal investigation that eventually led to arrests in 12 states and the seizure of over $40 million in illegal assets. But Robert Chen himself had vanished completely after the helicopter extraction, leaving behind only questions about his ultimate loyalties and current whereabouts. The most puzzling aspect of the entire affair remained Dave Morrison's identity and authority. Despite extensive investigations by multiple federal agencies, no one had been able to determine who had been broadcasting the personalized radio communications to Margaret. The information he had provided had been completely accurate, suggesting access to highly classified intelligence from multiple sources. Detective Williams' final theory, shared with Margaret during their last official meeting, was that Dave Morrison had been a federal agent, working for an oversight agency tasked with monitoring the competing investigations. The personalized radio broadcast had been an unofficial method of ensuring that an independent witness could document the activities that different agencies were either missing or deliberately ignoring. "We may never know the complete truth," Williams had admitted, "but your observations provided crucial evidence that helped us understand how Robert Chen had been manipulating multiple agencies. Without your documentation, We might never have realized the extent of the jurisdictional problems that allowed him to operate for so long. Margaret had returned to her quiet retirement, but the experience had changed her perspective on the world around her. She now understood that her peaceful neighborhood existed within a larger context of federal investigations, criminal organizations, and law enforcement activities that most residents never suspected. The radio broadcasts had pulled back a curtain on a world of covert operations and competing authorities that operated just beneath the surface of everyday life. Her new daily routine included more careful observation of her surroundings and a healthy skepticism about the apparent normalcy of suburban life. She had learned that neighbors might not be who they claimed to be, that federal agents might be working at cross purposes, and that mysterious voices on the radio might provide more accurate information than official sources. The house across the street remained empty after Robert Chen's departure. Federal agents had searched it thoroughly, finding sophisticated communication equipment and financial records that supported multiple ongoing investigations. But they had also discovered that the house had been equipped with surveillance equipment that had been monitoring the entire neighborhood, including Margaret's daily activities. This revelation had initially disturbed Margaret, but Detective Williams had assured her that the surveillance appeared to have been for Robert's protection rather than any malicious purpose. As a confidential informant working with multiple agencies, Robert had needed to monitor his environment for signs that his various loyalties had been discovered. Margaret had never learned whether Dave Morrison had been aware of Robert's surveillance capabilities, or whether the radio broadcasts had been a method of communicating with her while avoiding Robert's monitoring systems. The technical aspects of the case remained classified, leaving Margaret to speculate about the sophisticated technologies and procedures that had been involved in her strange experience. As she finished her morning coffee and prepared to start another day of retirement, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary week that had permanently altered her understanding of the world around her. She had become an accidental participant in a complex federal investigation, had documented the activities of a double agent, and had received personalized intelligence briefings through her kitchen radio from a mysterious source who might never be identified. The vintage radio sat quietly on her kitchen counter, providing nothing more than standard morning programming, but Margaret would never again listen to it without remembering Dave Morrison's voice and wondering if somewhere in the vast network of federal agencies and criminal investigations, there were other mysterious voices providing crucial information to unsuspecting civilians who had simply been in the right place at the right time to observe what professional investigators had missed. Her quiet retirement had taught her that the most extraordinary stories often began with the most ordinary activities, and that paying attention to the world around her could lead to discoveries that she never could have imagined. The radio had known what no one else did, and through her that knowledge had helped uncover a truth that might otherwise have remained hidden.